No one expected the collapse to start here. For 2 decades, Kaliningrad was sold to the Russian public as the one place Putin could never lose his immovable Western fortress, the outpost meant to prove that Russia's reach into Europe was permanent, unshakable, and strategically invincible. Moscow spoke of it as if it were destiny itself, a clenched fist lodged deep inside NATO territory, bristling with missile systems, naval power, radar installations, and factories that kept the region humming with military purpose. To the Kremlin, Kaliningrad wasn't just a map point, it was a message. Putin promised the people who live there the 4 things every society depends on: stability, prosperity, security, and victory. Year after year, they were told that this enclave would thrive while the rest of the world trembled. But the reality taking shape on the ground today is the exact opposite. Kaliningrad is not thriving. It is thinning out, breaking down, and quietly losing the very people who once kept it functioning. The story here isn't about tanks, sanctions, or NATO military drills. It is about something far more dangerous, because it is coming entirely from inside. Unemployment in the region has surged dramatically since the beginning of this year alone. Official statistics show a jump of more than 21%. Nearly 2,000 people have been added to unemployment rolls in a region barely over 1 million residents. The number itself is alarming. But what matters more than the number is who is falling out of the workforce. That is where the real political danger begins. More than 70% of the newly unemployed are women. Over 40 accountants, financial managers, administrative supervisors, economists, the quiet professionals who form the backbone of urban life. These are not dissidents or activists. They are the people who stabilize cities simply by showing up to work every day. The ones who believe that if they stayed loyal, worked hard, and avoided politics, the system would carry them through any storm. That unspoken bargain is now broken. When a local economy begins to fail, it doesn't start by cutting factory labor. It cuts the people who manage money. It cuts supervisors. It cuts accountants. And when accountants are being dismissed in large numbers, it means something fundamental has already snapped inside the system. The money has stopped moving. Businesses aren't making mistakes, they're running out of lifeblood. What makes this collapse even more dangerous is its invisibility. Kaliningrad isn't experiencing a dramatic crash that makes headlines. This is a hidden recession, the kind that reveals itself first in kitchens and grocery budgets long before it ever appears on state television. The average time it now takes to find a new job has stretched to 7 months. Think about the pressure that puts on a household living on the edge. 7 months without reliable income means savings disappear. Credit dries up. Families start rationing food. Parents skip meals so their children don't have to. The Kremlin can ban the word recession the same way it once banned the word war. But it cannot ban hunger. A mother staring at an empty refrigerator does not need access to economic data to understand that something has gone deeply wrong. In fact, the truth is now being spoken out loud only in private conversations, people whispering to each other about which neighbor lost their job this week, which coworker hasn't been paid in 2 months, which family is planning to leave. Outside Kaliningrad's main city, the situation is even worse. Agricultural towns and semi-industrial districts are seeing 2 or 3 people competing for every available job. Local officials, careful with their words, admit off record that they have lost control of job creation altogether. This is how social trust collapses in authoritarian systems, not with protests in the streets, not with strikes or mass demonstrations, but quietly, behind closed doors, it erodes family by family, household by household, until no one believes the future they were promised. Kaliningrad was never supposed to unravel. Yet this is precisely where the unraveling has begun. Not on the battlefield, not through foreign pressure, but through the slow internal suffocation of the very people the region was built to rely on. If the unemployment wave was the first warning sign, the next one came with far greater force. People began leaving Kaliningrad in numbers the Kremlin could no longer hide. Officially, Moscow reports population fluctuations. Unofficially, more than 150,000 residents have already packed their bags and crossed the borders into Lithuania, Poland, Germany, and anywhere else they can rebuild a stable life. For a region with barely over 1 million people, that number is not migration. It is evacuation. And the fear driving it is something no government propaganda can calm. Most of those leaving are not the young adventurers who usually travel first. They are trained engineers, medical workers, teachers, construction specialists, administrators, middle-aged professionals who once believed they would retire here. These are people with mortgages, families, aging parents, long histories, and deep roots. When individuals like that walk away from a place, it means the foundation beneath them has already collapsed. They describe the same pattern: wages stagnating or disappearing entirely, local hospitals understaffed, schools short on resources, and a growing sense that the region is becoming isolated, not only economically, but strategically. Kaliningrad was supposed to be fortified. Instead, locals are watching supply shortages, restricted rail routes, and tightened border controls that turn everyday logistics into a maze of delays and uncertainty. Prices on basic necessities rise every month, sometimes every week. Savings melt between paychecks. Even formerly secure sectors, like port services and military-adjacent industries, are trembling as budgets shrink and contracts stall. Then came the moment no one dared to say out loud, but everyone felt coming. The government began increasing military pressure inside the region: conscription sweeps, expanded training cycles, new checkpoints, and a surge of federal security forces sent to maintain order. That's when the panic truly started. For many families, the fear of being cut off from the outside world became more terrifying than the failing economy itself. And here lies the turning point that reshaped everything. People stopped believing they were safe. That realization spread faster than any official announcement ever could. Once the idea took hold that Kaliningrad might become a trapped territory if tensions with NATO escalated further, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Apartment listings exploded. Bus stations filled before dawn. Border queues stretched for hours. Men approaching draft age disappeared from workplaces with no explanation. Women began liquidating household assets, selling cars and furniture for whatever cash they could get. The silent exodus accelerated into a full-scale flight. The Kremlin tried to calm the panic, calling it Western rumor campaigns and insisting the enclave was protected, fortified, and fully supported. But people living there no longer trusted promises. They trusted patterns, and the pattern they saw was clear. More soldiers arriving, more police on the streets, more surveillance, more pressure, and less freedom to move. Combine that with an economy slipping deeper into the shadows, and suddenly the region that once felt like a prized jewel now feels like a tightening trap. Those who remain describe a ghost-like atmosphere. Streets, once crowded with workers, feel strangely hollow. Schools quietly merge classrooms. Clinics shrink hours. Small businesses close not with announcements, but with handwritten signs taped to locked doors. Even the soundscape has changed. Fewer delivery trucks, fewer commuters, fewer voices in the evening. A place built on the promise of strength now feels like it is being drained from the inside out. The tragedy is not only in the numbers, but in the stories carried by those crossing the border. Parents leaving behind the homes they built with decades of labor. College graduates giving up on careers before they begin. Professionals abandoning stability because stability itself has dissolved. The people leaving Kaliningrad are not fleeing opportunity. They are fleeing uncertainty, and uncertainty so deep, so unpredictable, that they would rather start over in a foreign country than wait for the ground under them to give way entirely. Kaliningrad was meant to symbolize Russia's power. Instead, it has become the most visible proof that the system meant to protect its citizens can no longer protect itself. While the exodus continued to grow, something even more unsettling unfolded inside Kaliningrad's institutions. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with administrative delays and unusual personnel changes. But soon, the pattern sharpened. Entire departments were left without leadership. Senior officials disappeared from public schedules. Meetings were abruptly canceled with no explanations. The government insisted everything was routine restructuring, yet people inside the system knew better. They recognized the signs of a structure under stress, a system tightening its grip because it no longer trusted its own foundation. Whispers started spreading among government workers about audits conducted at night, security officers visiting offices unannounced, files being confiscated without documentation. Those who had held positions for decades suddenly found themselves replaced by unfamiliar faces sent from Moscow individuals who answered not to the region, but directly to the Kremlin. For many locals, It felt like Kaliningrad was being placed under guardianship, as if the federal government feared that even its own officials might not stay loyal under mounting pressure. And that shift, subtle at first, had a profound psychological impact. Employees who once took pride in their roles now moved through their workdays with a quiet, cautious rhythm. Conversations lowered to whispers. Phones were avoided. People began removing personal documents from office drawers and taking them home, unsure if they would even return the next morning. Some workers found their access revoked overnight, their key cards suddenly inactive, with instructions to report for reevaluation. Others were summoned for lengthy interviews that felt less like performance reviews and more like interrogations. Then, in the middle of this tightening atmosphere, came the moment that changed everything. A mid-ranking transportation official, known locally for his openness and willingness to talk to residents, simply vanished. No announcement, no leave of absence, no explanation. One day he was at his desk discussing supply shortages. The next day his office was sealed and his name was erased from internal lists. It was the kind of disappearance people once thought only happened in darker eras of Russian history. And here is where the story takes its sharpest turn. That disappearance didn't just raise suspicion, it confirmed every fear that had been quietly building. From that moment on, the sense of danger became real. It wasn't the economy, it wasn't the border controls, it wasn't even the looming military tension. It was the realization that the government wasn't merely struggling, it was cracking from the inside, replacing trust with fear and allowing paranoia to seep into every corner of official life. That was the hook that pulled even the most loyal public workers into silence and caution. In the weeks that followed, more officials left their posts without farewell messages or retirement notices. Some moved abroad, some relocated to mainland Russia, others simply disappeared from public view. Their departures created gaps that the Kremlin filled with new appointees, whose presence only deepened the region's unease. These replacements rarely spoke to locals, rarely held public briefings, and rarely appeared anywhere except in tightly controlled meetings. It felt orchestrated, as if the region was being reshaped behind closed doors. For ordinary citizens, this uncertainty seeped into everyday life. People visiting government offices noticed the stiffness in the staff, the cautious glances, the reluctance to answer simple questions. Services slowed down, requests took longer, decisions stalled. The administrative machinery that once functioned with predictable rhythm now moved with uneven, anxious steps. Even routine paperwork felt like stepping into a room filled with invisible smoke, something unsettling in the air, something unspoken but palpable. The reality was stark. When the people responsible for maintaining order no longer feel safe, the community they serve begins to unravel. Kaliningrad was living that truth. The region's institutions were not collapsing in a dramatic spectacle, but dissolving quietly, like a structure losing its bolts one by one. The breakdown was not loud, but it was unmistakable. And as the system weakened, the fear strengthened. Families who had once relied on local stability now questioned whether the region had any stability left at all. Officials who had once enforced rules now feared being caught in them. Every disappearance, every replacement, every unexplained change became another reminder that no one truly knew who was in control or for how long. Kaliningrad was no longer just losing its people. It was losing its confidence, its backbone, its sense of direction. And in a place already strained by economic pressure and geopolitical tension, that loss was perhaps the most dangerous shift of all. As Kaliningrad's internal structure continued to weaken, the uncertainty began spreading beyond government offices and into the arteries of the region's economy. The industries that once defined the region, shipbuilding, logistics, manufacturing, found themselves struggling against pressures they could no longer hide. Contracts were delayed without explanation. Supply routes that had been stable for decades were suddenly rerouted or suspended altogether. Managers spoke carefully, as if every word had to pass through an invisible filter. Workers sensed the hesitation in their voices, and that alone was enough to spark quiet worry. The facade of normalcy held for a while, but every day it became harder to maintain. Factories that once operated around the clock began reducing shifts. Workshops that had always been loud with machinery grew quiet in the afternoons, their production floors half lit, as if the region were slowly powering down. Even the port, a place that had always symbolized the region's strategic purpose, showed signs of fatigue. Ships arrived late, some didn't arrive at all, And when they did, their cargo loads were smaller than anyone wanted to admit. The slowdown wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was the kind of decline that seeped in gradually, like cold air creeping into a house through a cracked window. Inside these industries, supervisors found themselves balancing two realities. On one hand, they had workers who needed answers. On the other, they had upper-level directives that revealed less than the rumors circulating on the shop floor. Rumors about sanctions hitting harder than reported, rumors about the Kremlin tightening control over military shipments, rumors about internal investigations targeting not just government officials, but industrial managers as well. The region felt caught between external pressure and internal suspicion, and no one knew where the next shift would come from. Then came the moment that shattered whatever illusion of stability remained. A major shipyard, one of the region's largest employers, announced an indefinite restructuring pause, a phrase no one had heard before. Workers were sent home with partial pay and vague promises of updates. The announcement spread through the region like a cold wave, touching every household that depended on the shipyard, every business that supplied it, every family that had built their lives around its payroll. It wasn't just a pause, it was a warning. And here, in the middle of this economic slide, came the hook that changed the public mood entirely. For the first time, people began to openly question whether Kaliningrad's isolation was no longer strategic but dangerous. That single shift in thinking changed everything. It created a kind of silent permission for people to voice the fears they had kept to themselves. Conversations in markets, in taxis, in crowded buses took on a different tone. People spoke not with anger, but with an almost resigned clarity. They wondered how long the region could withstand the shrinking job market, the vanishing investments, the tightening controls. They wondered if the Kremlin still saw Kaliningrad as a stronghold or merely as a territory to manage, even if it meant letting its people bear the weight of its decisions. The more the tension grew, the more the region's young professionals began making plans. Some quietly applied for work abroad. Others looked to Poland or Lithuania, hoping their proximity might offer an easier path out. For them, the issue wasn't ideology or opposition, it was survival. They had watched older generations lose stability. They refused to wait until it happened to them. Meanwhile, local businesses struggled to adapt. Cafes that once filled with young workers in the evenings now closed early because customers simply weren't coming. Clinics cut non-essential services because they lacked the staff to run them. Schools reported growing numbers of withdrawn students as families left the region altogether. Every departure added weight to the next, like threads unraveling from a fabric until the whole cloth weakens. This wasn't the dramatic collapse that many expect when they imagine a region under strain. It was something far more human and far more difficult to reverse. A gradual loss of confidence that spread from household to household until it became a defining atmosphere. People didn't need official data to understand what was happening. They could feel it in the silence of once busy streets, in the way neighbors packed their cars late at night, in the sudden appearance of "for rent" signs on apartments that had been occupied for years. And through it all, Kaliningrad's sense of identity, once rooted in purpose and pride, began to fade. The region was living in a suspended state, neither collapsing nor recovering, drifting in a direction no one could quite name. What made this moment so unsettling was not the lack of answers, but the growing suspicion that no answers were coming at all. By the time winter settled over Kaliningrad, the region seemed to carry a weight that people no longer tried to hide. The tension that had once been whispered now shaped daily life in ways too obvious to ignore. You could feel it in the way conversations paused when strangers passed, in the half-empty buses during rush hour, in the boarded-up storefronts that had quietly surrendered to a reality they could no longer fight. Yet even as the signs became clearer, one truth remained unspoken but widely understood. The region was waiting for something. Not for policy changes or economic rescue, but for a moment of honesty that had been denied for too long. That moment arrived slowly, not as a political announcement, but as a quiet shift in how people saw their own futures. Families that had spent generations in Kaliningrad started to confront questions they had avoided. Could they continue to build a life in a place where opportunity was shrinking and trust had drained away? Could they keep telling their children that things would improve when nothing around them suggested that improvement was coming? And in those questions, a new kind of clarity emerged, a recognition that the region's story was no longer being written by grand geopolitical promises, but by the small, painful decisions made inside homes every night. Some households chose to stay, determined to endure whatever came next. Others quietly prepared to leave, mapping routes, gathering documents, saving money where they could. But whether they stayed or left, all of them felt the same shift: the realization that they could no longer depend on the stability that had once defined the region. Kaliningrad used to be a place where people believed they understood the rules, even if they didn't always agree with them. Now, the rules seemed to be rewriting themselves without warning. In that uncertainty, something unexpected began to form, a kind of collective reflection about what the region had become and what it had been promised to be. People remembered the early years when Kaliningrad was presented as a beacon of Russia's westward ambition, a place that would thrive because of its strategic importance. That vision had been repeated so often it became part of the region's identity. But now, standing in the slower rhythms of a fading economy, many realized that the vision had been a story told to them rather than one written with them. And once a story loses its anchor, it becomes impossible to keep believing in it. For years, the Kremlin had insisted that Kaliningrad was a symbol of strength. But symbols only matter when the people living within them feel protected by their meaning. And here, in the closing days of a year marked by decline, people felt more like residents of an abandoned outpost than citizens of a strategic stronghold. They watched their neighbors depart. They saw their industries fall into uncertainty. And each departure, each closure, each unanswered question chipped away at the idea that the region still held the relevance it once did. Yet the most emotional part of this story is not the decline itself, but the resilience that still lived quietly inside the people who remained. They kept their routines. They supported each other where they could. They tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, even when normal life had slipped from their grasp. It is in these small acts, shared meals, open doors, conversations that stretch late into the night, that the region's human spirit revealed itself. That spirit, not any military installation or political speech, was what allowed Kaliningrad to endure. And as the year came to an end, the region stood in a place no one had expected, not broken, not defeated, but forced into a new awareness of its own fragility. The myth of invincibility had evaporated, replaced by something far more honest. Kaliningrad was not a fortress. It was a community of people navigating uncertainty with courage they rarely recognized in themselves. And in that realization, the story came full circle. Because the collapse everyone feared did not happen suddenly, and the hope everyone needed did not come from the Kremlin. It came from the quiet strength of people who understood that survival sometimes begins with acknowledging the truth. In the end, Kaliningrad's fate is no longer defined by the promises made about it, but by the people who live there, who continue to move forward even when the path is unclear. And perhaps that is the most powerful ending of all, not dramatic or triumphant, but deeply human, shaped by resilience, honesty, and the determination to keep going when the world around them refuses to stand still.